Good? Okay. Welcome back on this bright sunny morning and a good worship service welcoming new members to the congregation. It's a good day, and I know the cake is enticing out there and all of that good stuff. Let me just make a comment or two by way of review. Last week we spent some time dealing with Tim Alberta's own personal story and his kind of existential commitment in this topic, precipitated by his father's sudden death and his church, home church, in a very conservative suburb of Detroit. And we spent a bit of time dealing with that, and then we transitioned to a story, at least on some level, that people of our age remember. Jerry Falwell, the Moral Majority, and Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. And if you are like me, there is the surface level of the story or the situation. But Tim Alberta drills down at least a level or two to the really interesting questions, at least for somebody like me, with regard to the way in which Jerry Falwell transitioned into the Moral Majority, went from a separatist with regard to religion and the state, to somebody who wanted to take over the state with his own brand of religion. And, of course, not uniquely, but especially with his son, Jerry Jr., you see the power and you see the fall and the disgrace that both came upon him, the operation in Lynchburg, and also, I think, religion in America more generally. Some of you have heard me say this before. I think it's still true. If you haven't figured out by now, I can do all the talking. And I can talk from beginning to end. And if you have any doubt about that, I've been doing a lot of talking. I'd like to just begin today by breaking this up a little bit. Let's just pause and begin with thoughts. I don't know if you're like me, you do some of your best thinking after the session's over. And you may have mulled on certain questions during the week. And let's just pause. Now, there is a method in my madness. Having been a teacher for a long, long time, I look at the schedule. And as we go through, I'm calculating constantly, am I going to come out at the right place at the right time? And so I think we have a little bit of time to pause and reflect in terms of comments and questions. But again, if you don't have any, I can talk. Christy.
So I don't remember exactly where it was in the book, but he was having a conversation with a couple of other leaders, but also another journalist. I remember he mentioned who was of Jewish heritage. And they seemed to feel that the evangelical Christian movement was perhaps in its death throes. And the other journalist said, yes, but watch out for the death throes.
Was it David Brooks who said that in reply to him?
Sorry, there's so many.
Yeah, okay, the comment is that Tim Alberta was in a conversation or reflecting back on a conversation about the evangelical church and the idea that it is in its death throes because of some bizarre behavior and one thing and another. And I may be wrong, but I think he then reflected a comment by David Brooks, the conservative journalist, Jewish journalist, who by the way, just published in the New York Times, I think about Christmas time, a very interesting article about his own religious journey. Jewish fellow who spends more time going to church than he does to the synagogue, interestingly enough. And there's a line in there that really caught my attention. When asked what he accepts or believes, he said, I accept and believe the whole shebang. Judaism and Christianity. And how important this has become to him. He how did he say it? He grew up religious in the synagogue, but not necessarily believing. That's flipped around. He believes, but he thinks practicing the religion is critically important as well. So, Christy, I think I'm reflecting your question, but also the little wider notion about this, that evangelicalism might be able to have its death throes, but the spasms of death can be really violent. Yeah. Fran.
I was surprised by how the conservatives or Heresy or whatever are mad about churches closing during COVID. And were there state legislatures that said the churches can't open? I know we looked for advice from the Senate and closed during some of their times, but I know our pastor decided it was time to meet again, even before the Senate did. We did.
Yeah. Okay. Fran asks the question about during COVID, during the pandemic, churches choosing not to worship face-to-face, and in that sense, closing. And trying to seek guidance about this, what is, especially in the midst of the unknown nature of what we're dealing with. And there were many very conservative churches, evangelical, who refused not to gather publicly and in person. Now, I think that links up with some things we've already touched on and maybe we'll come back again to. There's a sensitivity on the part of many evangelicals, and this goes back quite a ways. They won't let us pray in schools. They won't let us put the 10 Commandments up in conspicuous and public places, especially on public property. Coming back to a reference I made last time about Bob Jones University and how Jerry Falwell absolutely hated Jimmy Carter. One of the reasons was that Bob Jones University had very racist policies, and they were going to be cut off from dispensing federal funds for students for tuition. And they thought that was a war against the church, Christianity, if not Christian civilization. So you can see now, we come fast forward to 2020, and a pandemic descends upon us, and state and local authorities are advising churches and others not to gather in person. Because in church in particular, there's singing going on, and there's intimacy and hugging and whatever else goes on during worship service, and that this could help spread the virus. All of a sudden, among certain American Christians, all of this starts to make sense. It's another conspiracy against the church. They're gonna close the church. Give me a break. What's responsible? Am I responding in any sort of helpful way, friend? I don't think we here in this church think that way about it. Gretchen.
I think fear drives a lot of this behavior. They're afraid of what they don't know. They're afraid they're not going to be a good girl or whatever. And it can trap you, and then it can flip around and make you think that you're better.
Yeah. Gretchen says, fear is a factor in this. Yes, I think. Richard?
Yeah, I'm a parent in school. I'm just barely old enough to remember that happening. And the counter response to that was, as long as there are pop quizzes in school, there will be prayer in school.
Okay. As long as there will be pop quizzes, there will be prayer in school. Yeah, and I think the whole issue of prayer in the public schools got it got twisted. Individuals can pray in school anytime they want, just public prayer, especially sanctioned by the teachers or administrators.
Yeah, this gets to the power part of the kingdom, power, and glory. They no longer felt they had the power to impose mandatory prayer on everybody.
Yeah, and simultaneously, what is happening in this country socially and demographically is it's becoming more and more diverse. So you not only have Jewish people in this country, but you have more and more Muslim people, Hindu people, and right on down the list, and you can't deny that there is a growing community of people who would identify themselves as none of the above, as secular folks. And so you can see that
Just on the fear thing, a real profound statement that I read last night in the book where he says, fear is as strong as faith. That just penned in, so those who would use it for their own ends of power know that.
Yeah. Fear is as strong as faith. Yeah. Ruth?
I also would like you to say a little more about that notion that conservative evangelical Christians developed about they were being persecuted and that the state was out to get them, and how that played such an important part of the momentum.
Yeah, this business about how the state, the larger society, had been taken over by unbelievers, secularists, and there's a war going on against Christianity, and we need to fight back. Now, if we go back to the first session, when I was trying to give you a kind of broader global view of some of these things, there is an apocalyptic dimension of this. They claim that their apocalypticism simply means a kind of revelation having to do with some sort of interruption of history and so on and so forth. And you can get all kinds of notions of this from the book of Revelation and elsewhere. perhaps in the Old Testament and in Christian history. So there is a war going on between good and evil. And obviously, we're on the good side, they're on the bad side, and this is a life and death struggle. Not only life on this earth, but beyond. It's serious. I had a colleague, not in my department at our institution, but who taught at North Dakota State University, and his interest was in American, right-wing American groups, religious in a sort of way, not necessarily Christian, and that would take up arms. There were some incidents in North Dakota and Montana and various places where these people who were enclavists, they withdrew, but they felt like they were in a religious war against the state. And John would interview these people. It just so happened that John really liked guns too, so he had something to talk about. This is the last comment, then we're going to have to get back on the agenda here. You remember the journalist, Peter Jennings? Canadian, I think, by heritage. I still remember, this was in the days when most of us watched, one of the major evening newscasts. And I had ABC on, I think Peter was on ABC. I had it on. He kind of shook his head at the opening and said, our three major stories tonight all come from Montana. Being a native Montanan, I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. That doesn't usually happen. Well, one of them was that the Unabomber had been captured. The other one was, and I'd heard about them, the Montana Freemen had barricaded themselves in a ranch out in eastern Montana, and they were involved in illegal things, and the authorities were after them. Now, there was something else, I don't really recall that, but it took place in Helena, and it had to do with this or that. Again, you see some of these phenomena, whether they're overtly evangelical, religious, Christian or not, tap into this business of being at war with the state. It's more of a Western phenomenon. A few years ago, we had the Malheur occupation in southeast Oregon. I sort of joke about Montana because they're all a little anti-government, not all. A lot of people are kind of anti-government there, and of course, guns. I think if you were interested in your own economic well-being, if you're a Montanan, you'd want the biggest federal government money could buy. If there weren't a federal government, you could put a sign on every border in the state of Montana, closed. From about every dollar that the citizens of that state send to the federal government, about 4 come back. Now, Oregon, I don't know where Oregon is in that, but it might be there a little bit there too, in some ways. Okay. You can see, I can just go forever. But let's come back to the agenda for today. Eventually, agenda anxiety takes over for me too. I want to turn to this Greg Locke and the Global Vision Bible Church, the Kingdom Builders, I've entitled this section. So from Lynchburg, Virginia, and the Falwells, we moved to Mount Juliet, Tennessee, to Greg Locke, the Global Vision Bible Church. And on the summit of a mountain in Wilson County, and I haven't bothered to look up where Wilson County is in Tennessee, but there, he says, stands a large tent. A tent with a sign out front that during the pandemic read, "This is a mask-free church, friend." Inside, as Alberta describes it, were guards, many of whom were armed, wearing camo, ostensibly protecting the large tent meeting from harm. Greg Locke saluted those gathered in this tent as soldiers rising up in God's army. You have the militaristic imagery, you have God, and they're rising up and are charged. He said they're ecstatically jumping up and down. Well, most evangelicals, according to Alberta, would not see themselves as part of this Christian demographic. For Greg Locke had suggested along the way that autistic children were demon-possessed, and he had supported a book burning to destroy the Harry Potter novels. Okay? He once referred, now get a load of this, once referred to President Biden, and I quote, as a sex trafficking demon-possessed mongrel. Again, I repeat, most American evangelical Christians would not see themselves in the orbit of Greg Locke and his Global Vision Bible Church. As one pastor warned Tim Alberta before he went there, this is downright dangerous. As Alberta reflects, yes, strange indeed, but relative to what? After what he had seen and heard about militarism and the imminent Armageddon, let alone the churches that hosted election deniers and speakers denouncing the satanic Black Lives Matter movement, the churches that see themselves as mainstream all seem rather old hat. Now, I think behind this, of course, he's a journalist, but behind this, I think, is a comment about the media ecosystem. The crazier, the more likely you are to get an audience and attention. The so-called church spectacles that seem all too common now would have stunned previous generations of churchgoers. What could have happened in the American spiritual ecosystem, especially parts of the evangelical wing of it? Now, Greg Locke began to cast himself as a lone voice of Christian courage, quite willing to shame others less committed to his bizarre form of Christianity. They're nothing but cowards, he would say. As he said, Christians are done being pushed around. If the secularists want war, that's what they will get. Increasingly, he aligned himself with the likes of Roger Stone, Dinesh D'Souza, and right-winger Charlie Kirk. You may or may not have heard of those folks, but they're out there. In order to secure his place as one of the evangelical church's most ardent supporters. Most ardent Trump supporters. His group, or so-called church, grew by leaps and bounds, and eventually his massive tent expanded to seat 3,000 people. Alberta says it would be the envy of Barnum and Bailey. Maybe it is, in fact, a little bit more like a circus with serious consequences. In any event, Locke was certainly a showman, and he attracted other such weirdos to his Sunday revivals or circus shows. In attendance at one of Locke's so-called revivals, Alberta reports that the preacher marveled at the massive turnout, likening it to a Billy Graham revival crusade. Here, Tim Alberta's reflections are important regarding Billy Graham. I could read you a few words, but for the sake of time, I'm simply going to summarize a little bit of that. He goes through this business of how Billy Graham had crusades. None of this business of guns and camo and all of that. It was all, in light of this kind of picture, quite tame. But Billy Graham did sidle up to political leaders over the years. But Alberta, and I remember reading this elsewhere at the time, Billy Graham repented of that. He realized he got too close to the likes of Richard Nixon and to others, and that tainted the church. What was the fuel then that kind of took over this revival movement sort of Christianity and drove Greg Locke's rise to prominence? 2 words: social media. Locke, who started out using social media very sparingly, soon came to live on social media. From ranting and raving about kids being indoctrinated in schools to taunting the Republican governor of Tennessee for refusing to sign a bill that would make the Bible the official state book. Well, we've got birds and we've got trees and plants. Why not a book? He wouldn't sign it. And Greg Locke, criticized him vociferously about that. More and more people flocked to his so-called revivals online, but some also drifted away. Some also drifted away in discomfort at the tactics that this guy was using. While Locke's church in the early days had been established on the basis of radical compassion, get a load of this, radical compassion, and now it was just radical. The compassion had gone away. We could at this point just write Greg Locke off and his Global Vision Church as a kind of wingnut operation. Bizarre, but not of much consequence. But this is where I think Tim Alberta's discussion gets really interesting. While he had tried to interview Locke, he had received no response to his requests. But several months after Alberta had visited the tent meeting, he got a call from Greg Locke. As he describes it, he'd expected hubris and hostility from Locke, but when he got there, Locke was skittish and filled with self-doubt. I think what I will do is just turn back to Tim Alberta and read a few words selectively about this. Greg Locke says to Tim Alberta, "Do I believe America is in decline? Absolutely, I do believe. We've come a long ways from our original values. Yeah, do I believe the Constitution and the Bible are under attack? 1,000%. That doesn't mean I'm going to take up arms against the government, Locke assured me. Then he added, I certainly believe in gun ownership, and I have told people, look, we still believe in the First Amendment right. If they show up at our tent to stop us, then we'll meet them at the door with our Second Amendment right. This rhetorical turnabout, making clear in one gulp of air that he draws a line at violence, then suggesting in the next that his congregants will shoot anyone who tried to prevent the church from convening, was representative of our longer conversation. The pastor was surprisingly pensive and receptive to tough questioning. He would regularly admit to having taken some things too far, and he lamented how a stray soundbite that went viral had distracted from the substance of his sermon. Then he would double down on the soundbite as if fearful that I took his contrition as cowardice. But Locke had just told me he did think Trump's re-election was stolen. He did subscribe to certain beliefs about vaccines and globalist schemes and a deep state regime that are commonly described as conspiracy theories. Might he grasp why some people who heard him preach with such authority and conviction about the central truth of Jesus and about the peripheral truth of these matters were merging the two belief systems into one? You know, I think that's a fair argument, he said. No doubt, the pastor replied, that's a fair argument. Then he laughed. I think people have a certain perception of me and of our church. It's like Jim Jones and the Kool-Aid. And all this stuff, when we really were just a bunch of people that preach verse by verse and line by line. I just get carried away sometimes. This business of wretched fear. He acknowledged we can operate sometimes in a spirit of fear. Because we see our rights being stripped from us, and that our kids are being taught and things that are glaringly and polar opposite from what we have grown up with. But I mean, even from my standpoint, I've grown. I'm almost 46 years old now. Are there times that it's been perceived that I care more about the kingdom of earth than the kingdom of heaven? Probably. And that was probably my fault. I probably shot myself in the foot and got a little too animated about things. Okay. You get the drift. There's a lot of ambivalence and tension in what seems to be going on behind the scenes. Hearing all of this, should we feel better, if not reassured, that as bizarre as this is, it is relatively harmless in the general landscape of 21st century America? Is this simply a strange mix of spiritual hyperbole run amok and reflective rationality all at the same time that, while misguided, can simply be ignored because over time it will simply burn itself out?
But what destruction did those flames cause?
Ah. It comes back to Christie's comment about the death spasms. Maybe so, but Tim Alberta was not reassured. In fact, he felt worse about the whole business. Because Greg Locke, despite his serious side, had discovered that there is a market for the irrational. Locke came, and this is a quote, to appreciate that wrath is a business model. The crazy is a church growth strategy. That hating enemies is far more powerful, at least in the immediate sense, than loving them. We may also add that there is a market for lies and mindlessness, both religiously and politically. That, you see, can be put on steroids in the mass media. From Alberta's point of view, rather than being curbed and brought into the mainstream evangelical fold, Locke made the evangelical fold surrender to him and his models for church growth and marketing. Uh-oh. As he says, it is much easier for many self-respecting evangelical Christians to live in denial about themselves, their pastors, and their churches, and to see the World Global Vision Church as an outlier. While the Locke model, he says, and I emphasize this, while the Locke model has crept quietly into the very fabric of the evangelical church. The Locke model has crept very quietly into the evangelical church. These pastors are now expected to have a political voice and presence. They are to be more than church leaders, more than preachers. In this world, uncertainty is punished, weakness is wokeness, and wokeness is the wrong decision, folks. You know, I'm never quite sure exactly what wokeness is, but you get the drift. As Alberta says, increasingly what congregants expect is less, Allison, less religious instruction than religious justification. In your role, we want to have our views endorsed, not challenged. Not we here, but in that world. That makes the pastoral role a very different thing. In this world, the clergy are expected to provide spiritual endorsement for their congregants' lives, and if they don't get what they want, they will leave. At the end of this road, says Alberta, is institutional ruin. When marketing or church growth strategies or any other kinds of business and media models for that matter come to prevail in the church, we can reasonably ask the question, what happened or what happens to the teachings of Jesus? Or what happens to the prophetic traditions in Scripture? Or what happens to the role of clergy? I would be the first to say that part of a healthy church and its identity in the 21st century is, in part, to be countercultural. I will be the first to say that. But to this claim clearly rises the stakes for all of us. What will we be countercultural about? What will we be countercultural about, and how does this conform to the vision of Jesus and the most noble traditions, the most noble features of the tradition, the most, and not the most base and violent ones? How do we learn to separate properly the realms of this world and the realm of God, not simply collapse them into each other? How do we acknowledge and distinguish the church and the American state. Pastor Aageson was introducing us to how the ELCA has and is thinking about this. And how do we engage the modern social issues of our time with compassion for the neighbor? If it's easier to condemn and hate them than it is to love them, something ain't right. All of these issues require us, in my view, to move beyond a kind of wooden biblical literalism or fundamentalism that can warp our theologies and church life in the service of a kind of means justifies the ends mode of operation that ultimately destroys the church's gospel message. And perhaps as importantly, we need a humble sense of uncertainty, even doubt. At least for me, doubt can function as the healthy flip side of faith, where we discover that truth in these theological and ethical matters need not always be singular, but are often plural. The sheer intensity of our belief cannot be a marker necessarily of its truthfulness. If I believe it extremely and fervently to the core, it must be right. Watch out. The sheer intensity of our belief cannot be a marker necessarily of its truthfulness. It could just as well be a mark of our own narrow-minded stupidity. Uh-oh, I better stop. I'm starting to preach. I have to leave that to the pastor. Okay. Let me pause. Do you see? There's the bizarreness, and you drill down and you try to get, with the help here of Tim Alberta, and those of you who are reading or have read the book, see this. That's where it often gets really interesting. Luann.
It strikes me that Locke seems very inauthentic. You know, as he admits that, yeah, I just kind of get carried away. I mean, he doesn't even have that conviction.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I think he knows that, yeah, this isn't really where I should be. But, you know, it works.
Yeah. I think that's right.
You're going to repeat the question.
I will. I will. Luann says that Greg Locke seems very inauthentic. Very inauthentic. He does one thing in a different context. He seems to reflect a different side of his personality, and it all comes across as inauthenticity. And the other dimension, which you hint at, is that the end justifies the means. It's a growth strategy. It's a business model that then may deny the very purpose of a church in the Christian community, or a synagogue, or any other religious institution. Well, we all, I think, have problems with ends justifying the means.
Well, I think that there
Tara?
was a time when inauthenticity mattered, but as we see now, it's blatant and out there. And I think it goes back to one of the very first question that was asked, defining extremism. And in my mind, I was thinking the piece that, for me, that helps define it, drives to motive. What's really behind it? Like,
Yeah.
so you're claiming to speak for God or speak to God's world or whatever, but what's really driving what's your motive for that?
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah,
where
yeah.
we see it in politics, right? It's not, and with the moral majority and all that, they were looking for a political win, not necessarily a spiritual win.
Right. That this how do I just summarize that? They're looking for, as a result of everything that they construct in their worldview, they're looking for power, control, you're saying, and the spirituality of the tradition can simply get discarded. Well, then, simply fold up the operation and don't pretend to call it a Christian community. Okay. I would like us to transition yet again. We'll have to finish this up next week. Part 5. For those of you who still have your syllabus sheets. The Orthodox monk Cyril Hoveran, religion and political religion, civil religion and political religion, the point and counterpoint of American extremist religion and Russian religion in the time of Putin. Now this seems to add another dimension to this whole thing. At an international meeting in France, now this goes back some years, Tim Alberta met Cyril Hoveran, an Orthodox Christian monk, a Russian Orthodox Christian monk, who had formerly been the aide-de-camp to Russian Patriarch Kirill, leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. Though born in Ukraine, Hoveran, he had taught a number of places throughout the world, well respected. As he describes it, as Hoveran describes it through the words of Tim Alberta, when the opportunity came, Hoveran felt a duty to lend his talents to the Russian Mother Church, and so took this position in Moscow with the Patriarch. The current meeting that Tim attends took place in France after Putin and Russia had taken and annexed Crimea in 2014, and had now invaded, up to now in 2022, Ukraine. As Hoveran estimated, for 80% of Russians, Christianity is a cultural identity thing rather than a typical religious thing. As Alberta states, quote, "Fortunately for the Kremlin, doctrinal conviction is not a precondition for religious tribalism," end quote. It's a cultural thing. And as the historian Mara Kozelski has stated, quote, "Orthodox Christian nationalism has been on the rise in Russia from the collapse of the Soviet Union," end quote. Nonetheless, Hoveran was taken aback in 2007 when Vladimir Putin stated at a global security forum his desire to recreate the old Soviet empire. At the same time, the regime began using language of restoring traditional values. That doesn't sound familiar to any of us in this country. To Hoveran, the Kremlin strategy seemed clear. The Russian government, the Patriarch, and the Russian Orthodox Church would partner to create a spiritual rationale for these policies. Policies that might otherwise be unpopular. Though from a very different country with a very different history, the problem of the state and the use of the church showed some similarities to the United States. We can see clearly why Tim Alberta might include this chapter in his book. Some of you people have probably traveled in Russia. Anybody here traveled? Yeah. You can go to some of those Russian churches today. I think of one out in Yaroslavl, which is about 160, 70 miles east of Moscow on the Volga River. And the iconostasis that has been reconstructed and restored, I think it's a World Heritage Site, is unbelievable. State money did it. And you can go to one church after another. Unlike the Soviets, who let them dilapidate or maybe used them for granaries, the current regime realized that the church can contribute to the apolitical agenda. Once Russia invaded Ukraine full bore in 2022, Patriarch Kirill was clearly operating in tandem with Putin. I remember at the end of February 2022, and as things started to progress violently in Ukraine, Pope Francis wrote a letter to Kirill asking him to oppose the carnage. Kirill said no, and he gave a very flimsy theological rationale. I remember reading it in translation. Any pretense of church independence was long gone in this effort. The church provided the Russian state and Vladimir Putin with the language of divine destiny to underwrite Mother Russia's historical and religious right to retake what it considered its own. Long gone was the Soviet Union's attempt to relegate the church to the dustbin of history. Now it was to co-opt the church. I remember vividly being at Moscow State University, hearing a lecture by a political scientist at Moscow State University, and he had spent a fair bit of time in the United States on sabbatical in the University of Michigan or wherever else. Spoke English beautifully, and he was going to lecture on the shape of the Russian constitution and government, which he did a very good job of, actually. But as with all of these things, it's one thing to describe what's written and how things function. He did not ever move into the second of those. And when it was over, this was after Crimea had been invaded and annexed, I said, well, as we were walking out, kind of sideline, I said, well, tell me about Crimea. I didn't really want to embarrass the fellow publicly, but he said, my dad was a Soviet military officer, and I grew up in Crimea. And the next thing he said was, I never heard anybody in Crimea speak Ukrainian. Ergo, they're ethnically Russian. You don't have to know too much about your 20th century European history to know that was the same language that Hitler used to move into the Sudetenland, because there were a lot of Germans there. It didn't turn out so well. During the early days, I appreciate Pope Francis and his petitioning the Archbishop of the Russian Orthodox Church. But I was not expecting anything positive to come of that, but I was interested in how the reply might come. Okay, and I'm just going to give you not a spoiler, but a hint of where we go from this next week, because there's another gentleman who shared the dais with Hoveran at this meeting in France. His name is Miroslav Volf. Anybody recognize that name? He is head of the Yale University Center for Faith and Culture. He is a Croatian by background. He is a Croatian. Now, anybody who studies seriously faith and culture has read Miroslav Volf. He's very good. And he teaches in this country. He spends his summer on an island off of the Croatian coast, not bad, summer duty, I think, and he writes considerably. So he's at this meeting in France with Hoveran. Tim Albert is there, and Miroslav Volf has some interesting insights about all of this as well, and we'll finish that up at the beginning of next week, okay? And then we will have a chance to move on next week to Seeing the Light, the Reconversion of Brian Zahn, and the Courage to Push Back. As I mentioned to somebody, Ruth, I guess it was, I've had to be strategic about what I select in this. And Brian Zahn is an interesting character in this as well. Blessings on all of you.